The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Natasha Williams pushed her cleaning cart down the sterile hallway of Metropolitan General Hospital. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the emergency room buzzed with its usual chaos. She had been working the night shift for 8 months now, invisible in her blue janitorial uniform, just another face in the background of life and death drama. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up with an old familiar warning she thought she'd left behind forever. The automatic doors of the emergency room burst open with violent force, and 3 men in dark clothing stormed inside. The first thing Natasha noticed wasn't their faces or their aggressive posture. It was the way they moved. Coordinated. Trained. Dangerous. Her body tensed with muscle memory she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. Everyone on the ground. Now. The leader shouted, his voice echoing off the white-tiled walls. Patients screamed, nurses ducked behind their station, and the security guard, old Bobby Martinez, fumbled for his radio with shaking hands. Natasha's instincts screamed at her to act, but she forced herself to crouch behind her cart like everyone else. She couldn't blow her cover. Not now. Not when she'd worked so hard to build this quiet, anonymous life. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the chaos unfold through the gap between her mop bucket and disinfectant bottles. Dr. James Patterson, the head of emergency medicine, stood frozen near the trauma bay. His dark eyes were wide with shock, his usually steady hands raised in surrender. The man who had shown her more kindness in 8 months than she'd received in her entire previous career was now staring down the barrel of danger, and every fiber of her being wanted to protect him. "Where is room 237? The leader demanded, grabbing a terrified nurse by her scrubs. "The patient who came in 2 hours ago. The one from the warehouse shooting." Natasha's blood ran cold. They weren't here for money or drugs. They were here for a witness. Someone who had seen something they shouldn't have, and now these men were willing to turn a hospital into a war zone to silence them forever. The nurse stammered and pointed toward the elevator bank. "Th 3rd floor. I see you. But you can't. We can do whatever we want," the man snarled. He gestured to his companions. "Tony, watch the exits. Rico, come with me. We're going upstairs." As they moved toward the elevators, Natasha saw her opportunity slipping away. Once they reached the 3rd floor, they'd have control of the entire hospital. Innocent people would die. Patients who couldn't defend themselves would become casualties in someone else's war. Dr. Patterson caught her eye across the room. For a moment, she saw something that made her chest tighten. He was looking at her not with the casual acknowledgement he might give any staff member, but with genuine concern. As if her safety mattered to him personally. That look changed everything. Natasha Williams, former federal agent, had spent 2 years hiding from her past. But some secrets were too dangerous to keep when innocent lives hung in the balance. As the gunman stepped into the elevator, she made a decision that would shatter the quiet life she'd built and expose the truth she'd been running from. She was going to have to become dangerous again. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, and Natasha rose from behind her cart. The scared janitor was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused. Someone with skills that could turn cleaning supplies into tools and hospital corridors into tactical advantages. Dr. Patterson was still watching her, and she could see the exact moment when he realized that the woman who had been quietly mopping floors and emptying trash cans for months was not who she appeared to be. "Stay with the patients," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made him blink in surprise. "Keep them calm. I'll handle this." Before he could ask questions she wasn't ready to answer, Natasha moved toward the stairwell, her mind already calculating angles and distances and the 100 different ways this night could end in tragedy. The gunmen thought they were hunting. They had no idea they just walked into the territory of someone far more dangerous than they could imagine. 3 years earlier, Agent Natasha Williams crouched behind an overturned car in downtown Chicago, her heart pounding as bullets shattered the windows above her head. The mission had gone sideways in the worst possible way, and now her partner lay bleeding in the street while their target disappeared into the crowd. "Control, this is Agent Williams. We need immediate medical assistance. Agent Thompson is down, repeat, Agent down." She spoke into her radio while applying pressure to Thompson's chest wound, watching his face grow pale in the flickering streetlight. "Copy that, Williams. Extraction team is 2 minutes out. What's your status on the target?" Natasha looked toward the alley where Vincent Caradu had vanished with his stolen federal files. The crime boss had information that could bring down 3 different criminal organizations, but chasing him meant leaving her wounded partner alone. "Target is gone. I'm staying with Thompson." That decision would haunt her for months. Thompson survived, but the files Cardew stole led to the deaths of 12 federal witnesses. The investigation that followed cleared her of wrongdoing, but Natasha couldn't clear herself. She'd chosen to save one life and lost 12 others in the process. 6 months later, she sat across from Director Richardson in his sterile office, staring at the resignation letter she'd just placed on his desk. "You're one of our best agents, Williams. This is a mistake." "No, sir," Natasha replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "The mistake was thinking I could keep doing this job and stay human. I'm done." Richardson studied her for a long moment. "What will you do?" "Disappear. Find something quiet. Something normal." She stood and walked toward the door. "Something where my decisions don't get people killed." The transition to civilian life was harder than she'd expected. Her skills were too specialized, her references too classified. She drifted from city to city, taking temporary jobs and trying to forget the weight of the weapon she no longer carried. When she saw the posting for a night janitor at Metropolitan General Hospital, it seemed perfect. Invisible work in a place that was always busy, where she could blend into the background and maybe find some peace in honest labor. The job interview was conducted by Mrs. Henderson from Human Resources, a kind woman in her 50s who seemed more interested in Natasha's willingness to work nights than her mysterious employment gap. "The emergency room can be intense," Mrs. Henderson warned. "Lots of trauma, lots of chaos. Some people find it overwhelming." Natasha almost smiled. After 3 years of federal raids and undercover operations, she thought she could handle cleaning up after doctors and nurses. "I'm used to high-pressure environments," she said simply. Her first night, she met Dr. James Patterson during the tail end of his double shift. He was sitting in the break room at 3 a.m., looking exhausted as he ate a cold sandwich. "You must be the new night janitor," he said, looking up with tired but kind eyes. "I'm James Patterson, head of emergency medicine." "Natasha Williams," she replied, surprised that he'd introduced himself at all. In her experience, people in positions of authority rarely bothered with the cleaning staff. "How are you finding it so far?" he asked, genuinely interested in her answer. "Quiet. I like quiet." James smiled. "Well, you won't find much of that here. But the work we do matters. Every clean room, every sterile surface. It's all part of saving lives." Over the following months, those brief interactions became the highlight of her shifts. James never treated her like she was invisible. He learned her name, asked about her day, even brought her coffee sometimes when he was making rounds. There was no condescension in his kindness, just basic human decency that she'd forgotten existed. Slowly, Natasha began to let her guard down. She developed routines, made small talk with the nurses, even attended the hospital's monthly potluck dinner. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. But old habits die hard, and part of her remained always alert, always watching. She noticed which corners offered the best sight lines, cataloged every exit and entry point, mentally mapped the hospital's layout with tactical precision. She told herself it was just paranoia, a leftover reflex from her old life. She never imagined those skills would become necessary again. The night everything changed started like any other. She'd finished cleaning the pediatric ward and was heading to the emergency room when she heard the commotion. Through the small window in the stairwell door, she watched 3 armed men storm into the space she'd come to think of as home. And she saw Dr. James Patterson, the first person in years to treat her with genuine kindness, standing in the line of fire. That's when Natasha Williams realized that some parts of yourself you can never really leave behind. The training, the instincts, the bone-deep need to protect innocent people, they'd been dormant, not dead. As she watched the gunmen terrorize patients and staff, she felt the familiar cold focus settling over her mind. The janitor was a disguise she'd worn for comfort, but underneath she was still exactly who she'd always been. Someone who knew how to fight back. Natasha pressed herself against the stairwell wall, listening to the chaos echoing from the emergency room below. But her mind kept drifting to the moments that had led her to care so deeply about the people in that room, especially Dr. James Patterson. It had been her 3rd week on the job when she first realized he was different from the other doctors. She was mopping near the nurses' station around midnight when she overheard Dr. Patterson talking to a homeless man who'd been brought in with pneumonia. "Mr. Johnson, I know you don't have insurance, but we're going to get you better," James had said, his voice patient and warm. "The social worker will be by in the morning to help you apply for assistance. In the meantime, we'll take care of you." The older man had tears in his eyes. "Nobody's called me Mr. in years, Doc." James had smiled and patted the man's shoulder gently. "Everyone deserves respect, Mr. Johnson, regardless of their circumstances." Later that same night, Natasha was cleaning the break room when James walked in, looking exhausted after a particularly difficult shift. A teenager had been brought in after a car accident, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't save him. Rough night? Natasha asked quietly. She usually didn't engage in conversation, but something about his defeated posture made her speak up. James looked surprised that she'd addressed him directly. Yeah. 17 years old. Had his whole life ahead of him. He sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs. Some nights I wonder if I'm making any difference at all. You are, Natasha said with quiet certainty. I see how you treat people. It matters. He looked at her, then really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Thank you for saying that. I don't think I caught your name properly when you started. Natasha. Natasha Williams. Well, Natasha Williams, thank you for listening. And for keeping this place clean and safe for our patients. Your work matters too. It was such a simple thing, basic human acknowledgement, but it hit her harder than she'd expected. In her old life, she'd been Agent Williams, defined by her badge and her mission. Here she was just Natasha, and somehow that felt more real than anything she'd been before. Their interactions became more frequent after that. James would stop by while she was working to share a cup of coffee or just exchange a few words about their day. He told her about his patients, never breaking confidentiality, just sharing the emotional weight of the job, and she found herself opening up in small ways about her desire for a quieter life. I used to work in security, she told him one night, which was technically true. High stress, lots of travel. I prefer this. What made you change careers? He'd asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Natasha had hesitated, then settled on a version of the truth. I got tired of seeing people get hurt. Here, I get to be part of healing instead. James had nodded thoughtfully. That's beautiful, actually. Most people don't realize how important the support staff is to patient care. A clean, organized environment helps people heal faster. He never made her feel lesser for choosing manual labor over her previous career. If anything, he seemed to respect her decision to do honest, straightforward work. The moment Natasha realized her feelings for James went deeper than friendship came during the hospital's Christmas party. She normally avoided social events, but James had personally invited her, and she couldn't bring herself to disappoint him. She stood awkwardly by the punch bowl, watching doctors and nurses mingle in their casual clothes, feeling out of place in her simple sweater and jeans. James appeared beside her, wearing a red sweater that made his dark eyes even warmer. I'm glad you came, he said, smiling at her. You look nice. Different without the uniform. Thanks. You too, she replied, then immediately felt foolish for the awkward response. Would you like to dance? He asked, gesturing toward the small area where a few couples were swaying to soft holiday music. Natasha's first instinct was to decline. Dancing meant being close, being seen, being vulnerable in ways her training had taught her to avoid. But the hopeful look in James's eyes made her nod before she could stop herself. They moved together slowly, carefully, his hand warm against her back. For those few minutes, Natasha forgot about her past, her secrets, her constant vigilance. She was just a woman dancing with a good man who made her feel normal and worthy of kindness. You know, James said softly, I don't know much about your life before you came here, but I'm grateful you're here now. The place is brighter with you in it. Natasha's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't express. How could she tell him that he'd given her something she'd thought was lost forever? A sense of belonging. How could she explain that his simple decency had made her remember what she'd been fighting to protect all those years as an agent? Thank you, she whispered, meaning it more than he could possibly know. Now, crouched in the stairwell with armed men threatening the hospital, all of those moments crystallized into fierce determination. James Patterson was a good man in a world that often punished goodness. He saw worth in people others overlooked, treated everyone with dignity, and had somehow seen past her carefully constructed walls to offer friendship to a woman he knew almost nothing about. She wasn't going to let anything happen to him. Moving quietly toward the first floor, Natasha felt the last of her hesitation fall away. The janitor's uniform was still her disguise, but underneath it, she was who she'd always been. Someone willing to put herself between innocent people and danger. James had given her a reason to care about staying hidden, but more importantly, he'd given her a reason to fight. Natasha moved silently through the stairwell, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that had made her one of the FBI's most effective agents. The hospital was no longer just her workplace, it was a tactical environment, and she needed to understand every advantage and vulnerability before she made her next move. From her position on the stairwell landing, She could hear the gunmen's voices echoing from the third floor. They were moving methodically through the ICU room by room, searching for their target. That gave her perhaps 10 minutes before they realized their witness wasn't where they expected and expanded their search. She pulled out her phone and quickly accessed the hospital's internal directory, something she'd memorized during her months of working here. Room 237 had been transferred to the secure wing on the 4th floor 2 hours ago. Information the gunmen clearly didn't have. Their witness was safe for now, but once they figured out their mistake, they'd become desperate and unpredictable. Natasha closed her eyes and mentally mapped the building's layout. 5 floors, 2 stairwells for elevators and dozens of interconnected corridors. Multiple exits, but most would be locked after midnight. The loading dock in the basement would be open. That's probably how the gunman had entered without triggering the front desk security. She thought about the personnel still in the building. Approximately 40 staff members working the night shift, plus about 60 patients in various states of mobility. Too many people to evacuate quickly, especially with the gunman controlling the elevators and main exits. Her cleaning cart sat abandoned in the emergency room, but it contained items that could be useful. Industrial-strength ammonia and bleach, which could create a disabling gas if mixed properly, extension cords that could serve as restraints, and her heavy-duty flashlight that doubled as an effective weapon. But first she needed to understand who she was dealing with. Natasha crept back down to the 1st floor and positioned herself where she could observe the emergency room. The remaining gunman, Tony, according to their leader, was pacing nervously near the main desk, his weapon trained on the staff and patients huddled on the floor. She studied his movements, his posture, his grip on the gun. Amateur. Nervous energy constantly shifting his weight, finger too tense on the trigger. Dangerous because of his unpredictability, but not professionally trained. This was muscle, not military. Dr. Patterson sat with his back against the nurse's station, staying close to Mrs. Chin, an elderly patient who was clearly terrified. Even in this crisis he was trying to comfort others. Natasha felt her resolve strengthen. The radio at Tony's belt crackled to life. "Tony, you copy?" "Yeah, Rico. What's your status?" "Room's empty. Kid's not here." Someone moved him. Tony swore loudly, causing several patients to flinch. "Boss ain't gonna like this. You check with the nurses up there?" "Already did. They're saying he got transferred to another floor, but they don't know which one." Natasha watched Tony's agitation increase. Amateur criminals were most dangerous when their plans fell apart. They made emotional decisions instead of logical ones. "Look," Tony barked into the radio, "we tear this place apart room by room if we have to. Kid's gotta be somewhere." "Copy that. We're heading back down. Keep those people quiet." Natasha had perhaps 3 minutes before the other two returned. She needed to act fast, but more importantly she needed to be smart. 3 armed men in a building full of innocent people required surgical precision, not brute force. She moved carefully around the perimeter of the emergency room, using her knowledge of the hospital's layout to stay in the blind spots. The supply closet near the trauma bay contained the items she needed most: zip ties from the supply shipments, a heavy wrench from the maintenance kit, and medical restraints that could be repurposed. As she gathered what she needed, Natasha's training kicked in fully. She wasn't just a former agent anymore. She was a weapon with 8 months of detailed knowledge about this building and genuine emotional investment in protecting its people. The elevator dinged softly, and she heard footsteps approaching the emergency room. Rico and the leader were returning, and their frustration would make them more volatile. Natasha positioned herself behind a mobile medical cart, directly in line with the corridor they'd use to return to the main area. The leader would enter first. He was clearly the decision-maker, the one who'd planned this operation. Take him out of the equation and the other two would likely panic. "Any problems down here?" she heard the leader ask Tony as they entered. "Nah, everyone's been quiet. Real cooperative." "Good. Because now we're gonna ask some questions and these people better have answers." Natasha watched as the leader approached the group of patients and staff, his demeanor shifting from controlled to threatening. This was the moment when their operation would turn from robbery to torture, when desperate men would start hurting innocent people to get information. She couldn't let that happen. Dr. Patterson looked up as the leader approached, and for just a moment, his eyes found hers through the gap in the medical equipment. She saw recognition there, not of her identity but of her intent. Somehow, he understood that she was no longer the quiet janitor he'd known. She held his gaze for one crucial second and saw him give the smallest nod. Whatever was about to happen, he trusted her. That trust was worth more than any backup or tactical support she'd ever had. Natasha Williams took a deep breath, felt the familiar cold calm settle over her mind, and prepared to remind 3 criminals why some people choose to become federal agents. They were about to learn that the most dangerous person in the room had been invisible to them all along. The leader grabbed Dr. Patterson by his coat and hauled him to his feet, pressing the gun against his temple. "You're the head doctor, right? That means you know where they moved my witness." James kept his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his head. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been down here all night. Don't lie to me." The man's voice rose, echoing off the sterile walls. "Some kid got brought in from a warehouse shooting. Saw something he shouldn't have. Now he's gonna have an accident in his hospital bed unless you tell me where he is." Natasha watched from behind the medical cart, her muscles coiled and ready. She'd identified her target. The leader was too volatile, too likely to pull the trigger if surprised. But Rico stood slightly separated from the group, near the supply cabinet, his attention focused on the hostages rather than scanning for threats. Big mistake. She moved like a shadow, years of training allowing her to navigate the cluttered emergency room without making a sound. Rico's back was to her, his posture relaxed because he thought they controlled the situation completely. Natasha struck with surgical precision. Her left hand clamped over his mouth while her right arm locked around his throat in a sleeper hold. Rico struggled for perhaps 3 seconds before the pressure on his carotid artery sent him into unconsciousness. She lowered him silently to the floor, quickly zip-tying his hands and feet with supplies from her cleaning cart. 1 down. 2 to go. She retrieved Rico's radio and weapon, then moved to her next position. The leader was still interrogating James, growing more agitated by the moment. "I'm gonna count to 5, Doc. Then I start shooting patients until someone tells me what I want to know." 1. Natasha positioned herself behind the pharmacy window, angle calculated to give her a clear shot at Tony while keeping the leader's attention focused forward. 2. She picked up a metal bedpan from her cart and hefted it carefully. Not elegant but effective. 3. The bedpan flew in a perfect arc, striking Tony in the back of the head with a solid clang. He stumbled forward, his gun clattering across the floor as he fell to his knees, dazed but conscious. "What the hell?" The leader spun around, searching for the source of the attack, his grip on James loosening slightly. That was the opening Natasha needed. She vaulted over the nurse's station with fluid grace, landing behind the leader before he could process what was happening. Her knee drove into the back of his leg, sending him stumbling, while her hand grabbed his wrist and twisted sharply. The gun fell from his nerveless fingers. "Security!" she shouted, loud enough for the patients to hear. "Stay down." The leader was bigger than her, stronger, but Natasha had advantages he couldn't see. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply to his wrist to cause maximum pain, how to use his momentum against him, how to turn his size into a liability in the confined space of the emergency room. He swung at her with his free hand, a wild haymaker that would have knocked her unconscious if it had connected. But Natasha was already moving, ducking under his arm and driving her elbow into his solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping for air. "Who are you?" he wheezed, staring at her with shock and growing fear. "Someone who really likes the night shift," Natasha replied, then swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard and she was on him immediately, using medical restraints to secure his hands behind his back. Professional. Efficient. No unnecessary force, but absolutely no doubt about who was in control now. Tony was struggling to get back to his feet, still groggy from the bedpan strike. Natasha moved toward him calmly, her demeanor completely transformed from the quiet janitor who'd been invisible for 8 months. "Don't," she said simply. "Stay down, hands behind your head, and this ends quietly." Tony looked from her to his unconscious partner to his restrained leader, processing the impossible situation. A cleaning lady had just taken apart their entire operation in less than 2 minutes. "You're a cop," he said, the words half question, half accusation. "I'm someone who takes her job very seriously," Natasha replied. "And my job is keeping this hospital safe." She secured Tony with the remaining zip ties, then quickly checked on the hostages. Several patients were crying, but no one appeared injured. The staff looked shell-shocked but unharmed. Dr. Patterson approached her slowly, his dark eyes wide with questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Natasha? How did you?" "Are you hurt?" she asked, deflecting his question while checking him for injuries. Her hands shook slightly as she examined him, the adrenaline from the fight mixing with the relief that he was safe. "I'm fine. But that was..." He struggled for words. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to do that?" Before she could answer, Rico's radio crackled to life. Her blood went cold as she heard a fourth voice, one that hadn't been in the emergency room. Rico, Tony, you copy? I've got eyes on the witness. Kid's in room 412. But there's a problem, hospital security just called the cops. We've got maybe 5 minutes before this place is crawling with uniforms. Natasha grabbed the radio. Change of plans, she said, disguising her voice. Abort and extract. Too much heat. Who is this? Where's Rico? The radio went silent. Their fourth man knew something had gone wrong. Natasha looked at Dr. Patterson, seeing her own realization reflected in his eyes. The immediate threat was over, but their witness was still in danger. And somewhere in this hospital, a fourth gunman was closing in on a patient who couldn't defend himself. James, she said, using his first name for the first time while they weren't dancing, I need you to call security and have them lock down the 4th floor. Right now. How do you know about? Please. Just trust me. He pulled out his phone without another question, and Natasha felt something shift between them. The careful distance she'd maintained for months was gone, replaced by partnership born of crisis. But the night wasn't over yet. And upstairs someone was still hunting. Dr. Patterson finished his call to security and turned back to Natasha, his expression a mixture of admiration and confusion. Buildings locked down. Security's heading to the 4th floor. He paused, studying her face. But you already knew there was a fourth man, didn't you? Before the radio call. Natasha was securing the zip ties on the unconscious Rico when she realized she couldn't keep deflecting James's questions. Her cover was blown completely. No janitor moved like she just moved. No civilian had the tactical knowledge she displayed. It's complicated, she said quietly, avoiding his eyes. Natasha. His voice was gentle but firm. What I just witnessed wasn't complicated. It was professional. You took down 3 armed men like you've been training for it your whole life. Before she could respond, Officer Martinez burst through the emergency room doors with 2 other security guards. The elderly man's eyes went wide as he took in the scene, 3 restrained suspects and a janitor standing calmly in the middle of the chaos. Jesus, Natasha. What happened here? Armed robbery attempt, she replied simply. They were looking for the witness from the warehouse shooting. The one who got transferred to the secure wing. Martinez looked between the subdued gunman and Natasha, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. You did this? All 3 of them? They weren't expecting resistance, Natasha said, which was technically true. As Martinez and his team began processing the scene, James pulled Natasha aside. We need to talk. Privately. She nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. They walked to the small consultation room off the main emergency area, and James closed the door behind them. Who are you? He asked directly. And don't tell me you're just a janitor who got lucky. Natasha sat down heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, and with it, the certainty that had carried her through the fight. Now she had to face the consequences of her actions. My name is Natasha Williams, she said. That part is true. But. She took a deep breath. But I used to be Special Agent Natasha Williams. FBI. Specialized in organized crime and federal witness protection. James sat down across from her, his expression shifting as pieces fell into place. The security job you mentioned. You were undercover? No. I mean, yes, I worked security but not undercover. I was a real agent. Until 2 years ago when I resigned. She met his eyes. I came here to disappear, James. To be nobody special, just someone who cleaned floors and minded her own business. What changed? You did. The words came out before she could stop them. All of you. This place became home. You became important to me. James was quiet for a long moment, processing her revelation. Those men tonight. They were after a federal witness. Probably. The warehouse shooting made national news. If their witness saw enough to identify key players in organized crime, he's worth killing for. Natasha rubbed her temples. I should have stayed hidden. Should have let security handle it. And let innocent people get hurt? Let me get hurt. That would have been the smart play. The safe play. James leaned forward, his voice intense. Natasha, you saved lives tonight. Including mine. I don't care what your background is or why you're here. What I care about is that when people needed help, you stepped up. You don't understand. My old life, it follows me everywhere. I left the bureau because I made choices that got people killed. I thought if I disappeared, became invisible, maybe I could do some good without putting anyone else at risk. What happened? James asked gently. Natasha told him about Chicago, about Thompson, about the witnesses who died because she'd prioritized saving her partner over stopping their target. James listened without judgment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "So you became a janitor to punish yourself," he said when she finished. "I became a janitor to disappear. To find some peace in honest work that didn't require life or death decisions. But tonight you made a life or death decision anyway. Tonight I couldn't stand by and watch good people get hurt. Especially..." She trailed off. "Especially what?" "Especially you." She looked at him directly. "James, you've been kinder to me than anyone has in years. You treated me like I mattered, like my work had value. For the first time since I left the bureau, I felt like maybe I wasn't broken." James reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not broken, Natasha. You're someone who's been carrying too much guilt for too long." His touch was warm, steady, and for a moment she let herself believe that maybe her past didn't have to define her future. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we make sure that witness stays safe and we figure out how to move forward," James said firmly. "Together." Before Natasha could respond, Martinez knocked on the door. "Doc, we've got a problem upstairs." James and Natasha hurried to the 4th floor, where they found the secure wing in chaos. 2 security guards stood outside room 412, both looking shaken. "What's the situation?" James asked. "The 4th gunman got to the witness before we could lock down the floor," Martinez explained grimly. "Kid's name is Kevin Thompson, 17 years old, critical condition from the warehouse shooting. The gunman's got him barricaded in the room." Natasha felt her stomach drop. Another Thompson. Another teenager whose life hung in the balance because of criminals and federal cases and the endless cycle of violence she tried to escape. "Has he made any demands?" she asked. Martinez looked surprised that she was asking tactical questions, but James nodded encouragingly. "Tell her everything. She knows how these situations work. Wants safe passage out of the building. Says if anyone tries to come in, he'll finish what the warehouse shooting started." Martinez shook his head. "Kid's barely conscious from his injuries. Can't even speak above a whisper." Natasha moved to the small window in the door, carefully observing the scene inside. The gunman, younger than the others, maybe mid-20s, stood near the bed with his weapon trained on Kevin Thompson. But something was off about his posture, his positioning. "James, I need you to pull Kevin's medical files. Specifically what injuries he sustained and his current condition." "Why?" "Because our gunman doesn't know what he's dealing with, and that might be our advantage." While James accessed the hospital's computer system, Natasha studied the room's layout. Standard ICU setup, but the secure wing had been modified with reinforced doors and limited access points. The gunman had chosen his position well, too well for someone who just improvised this backup plan. "Here," James said, pulling up Kevin's chart on a tablet. "Multiple gunshot wounds to the torso, emergency surgery 6 hours ago. He's stable but heavily sedated. Internal bleeding was repaired, but he's on pain medication that would make him groggy and disoriented." Natasha nodded grimly. "So he can't run, can barely speak, and probably can't give a clear statement about what he witnessed even if he wanted to. Then why is this guy so desperate to get to him? Because Kevin saw something specific. Something that would be recognizable even through painkillers and trauma." She turned to Martinez. "Has anyone tried to communicate with the gunman?" "Not yet. We were waiting for SWAT, but they're 20 minutes out." "We don't have 20 minutes, Natasha said. "That kid is critically injured. The stress and fear could kill him even if the gunman doesn't." James looked at her intently. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that gunman chose this room because he thought it was isolated and defensible. But he doesn't know the hospital like we do." She turned to Martinez. "The secure wing, it has its own ventilation system, right? Separate from the main building?" "Yeah, for infection control." "Why?" Natasha was already moving toward the maintenance panel at the end of the hallway. "Because every room has an emergency oxygen shutoff valve. If we can access the mechanical space above the ceiling, we can control the airflow." "You want to gas him out?" Martinez asked, alarmed. "I want to create a distraction. Something that forces him to move away from Kevin's bed." She looked at James. "But I need someone who knows the medical equipment in that room. Someone who can talk me through which machines are critical and which ones we can safely interrupt." James understood immediately. "The ventilator and heart monitor are essential. Everything else we can work around." "Good. Martinez, I need you to keep the gunman talking. Make him think you're negotiating." "James, you're with me." They moved quickly to the service elevator that accessed the mechanical floors. As they climbed into the cramped space above the ceiling tiles, James grabbed her arm gently. Natasha, are you sure about this? If something goes wrong. Something's already wrong, James. A kid is going to die if we don't act. She met his eyes in the dim maintenance lighting. I spent 2 years running from situations like this. I'm done running. They crawled through the narrow space above the ceiling, James guiding her toward room 412 using his knowledge of the hospital's layout. Below them, they could hear Martinez's voice through the intercom, trying to establish dialogue with the gunman. This is Officer Martinez. Can you hear me? We want to work this out peacefully. I want a car and safe passage, came the muffled reply. Any tricks and the kid dies. Natasha found the ventilation control panel and quietly began disconnecting non-essential airflow to the room. Within minutes, the temperature would start to rise, the air would feel stale. Nothing dangerous, but uncomfortable enough to make someone want to move away from the bed toward the door. James, she whispered, in about 3 minutes the room's going to get warm and stuffy. When that happens, I need you to use the intercom to tell Martinez to offer the gunman water. Something to drink. Make it seem like a humanitarian gesture. Why? Because when someone's uncomfortable and stressed, they become more susceptible to suggestion. If we can get him to move even 2 feet away from Kevin's bed, I can end this. They made their way back to the hallway where Martinez was still attempting to negotiate. True to Natasha's prediction, within minutes they heard the gunman's voice, more agitated than before. It's too hot in here. Turn the air conditioning up. James stepped forward to the intercom. This is Dr. Patterson. I can adjust the temperature, but it'll take a few minutes for the system to respond. Officer Martinez, maybe we should offer him some water while he waits. Good idea, document. Martinez spoke into the intercom. Sir, we'd like to send in some bottled water. You must be getting thirsty in there. Just fix the air. But there was uncertainty in the gunman's voice now. The discomfort was affecting his decision-making. Natasha positioned herself at the door, listening carefully to movement inside the room. She heard footsteps. The gunman was pacing, moving away from the bed. I'm going in, she whispered to James. How? The doors locked from inside. Natasha smiled grimly and pulled out her keycard, the same master access card that let her clean every room in the hospital during her night shifts. Advantage of being invisible for 8 months. Nobody thinks to revoke a janitor's access. She swiped the card quietly, heard the soft click of the lock disengaging, and slowly pushed the door open. The gunman stood near the window, wiping sweat from his forehead, his back partially turned to Kevin's bed. Exactly where she needed him to be. Natasha moved like a shadow, crossing the room in 3 silent steps. The gunman sensed motion and began to turn, but she was already inside his guard. Her hand clamped down on his wrist, controlling the weapon, while her other arm wrapped around his throat. Don't move, she said quietly. The patient is critical. Any sudden movements could kill him. The gunman struggled briefly, then went limp as the sleeper hold took effect. Natasha lowered him to the floor and secured him with the medical restraints James quickly provided. Kevin Thompson opened his eyes weakly, looking confused and frightened. James immediately moved to his bedside, checking his vital signs. It's okay, Kevin. You're safe now. Just rest. The boy's eyes found Natasha and he managed a whisper. Thank you. She felt tears threaten, remembering another Thompson who hadn't been so lucky. But this time was different. This time she'd been able to save someone. James joined her as Martinez and his team secured the unconscious gunman. 4 for 4, he said quietly. Not bad for a night janitor. Not bad for a team, Natasha corrected and meant it. As they walked back toward the elevator, James took her hand. So what now? Do you disappear again? Natasha looked at their joined hands, then at his face, kind, concerned, hopeful. For the first time in 2 years, disappearing was the last thing she wanted to do. I don't know, she said honestly. My cover's blown. Everyone's going to know I'm not who I pretended to be. No, James said firmly. Everyone's going to know exactly who you are. Someone who protects people. Someone who steps up when others need help. Someone worth knowing. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Natasha, I don't care about your past or your secrets. I care about the woman who's been bringing light to this place for 8 months. The woman who danced with me at the Christmas party. The woman who just risked everything to save people she barely knows. James? I'm falling in love with you, he said simply. All of you. The agent, the janitor, the hero, the woman who just wants to help people heal. Stay, please. Let me prove to you that your past doesn't define your future. Natasha felt something inside her chest break open. Not with pain, but with possibility. For the first time since Chicago, since Thompson, since all the guilt and running and hiding, she could see a path forward that didn't involve being alone. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. James smiled and pulled her into his arms, right there in the hospital hallway where they'd first met, where she'd found something she didn't even know she was looking for. They still had questions to answer, reports to file, and a future to figure out. But for the first time in years, Natasha Williams wasn't afraid of what came next. 6 hours later, as dawn light filtered through the hospital windows, Natasha sat in the security office giving her statement to Detective Rodriguez from the Metropolitan Police. The events of the night had drawn attention from multiple agencies, local police, FBI, and even federal marshals responsible for witness protection. So you're telling me, Detective Rodriguez said, reviewing his notes, that a hospital janitor single-handedly neutralized 4 armed suspects who were attempting to eliminate a federal witness? I'm telling you that someone tried to hurt innocent people in my hospital, and I stopped them, Natasha replied evenly. The rest is just details. Rodriguez looked skeptical, but before he could press further, the door opened and a familiar figure entered. Natasha's heart sank as she recognized Director Richardson, her former supervisor from the FBI. Agent Williams, he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Or should I say Ms. Williams? Director Richardson. I should have known you'd show up eventually. Richardson dismissed Detective Rodriguez with a polite nod, then sat down across from Natasha. Imagine my surprise when I got a call this morning about a hospital incident involving someone matching the description of one of my former agents. Someone who supposedly wanted to disappear and find something normal. I did disappear. I was normal. Until tonight. Normal people don't take down organized crime hit squads, Natasha. Normal people call 911 and hide. Natasha leaned back in her chair, feeling tired. What do you want, Director? I want to offer you your job back. The words hung in the air between them. For 2 years, Natasha had dreamed of being asked to return, of being told that her skills were still valued despite her mistakes. Now that the moment was here, she felt nothing but uncertainty. Kevin Thompson is awake and talking, Richardson continued. Turns out he witnessed Vincent Caradu, remember him? Executing 3 rival gang members in that warehouse. With Thompson's testimony, we can finally put Caradu away for life. Natasha's blood went cold. Caradu? He's behind this. The same Vincent Caradu whose stolen files led to 12 witness deaths. The case that made you resign. Richardson leaned forward. Poetic justice, don't you think? You get the chance to finally take down the man who's haunted you for 2 years. Through the office window, Natasha could see James talking with some of the other doctors, probably explaining the night's events. He looked tired but determined, and when he caught her eye, he smiled reassuringly. I have a life here, she said quietly. You have a hiding place here, Richardson corrected. But what happened tonight proves you can't run from who you are. You're a federal agent, Natasha. It's in your blood. Tonight, when the chips were down, you didn't hesitate to become that person again. I became that person to protect people I care about. That's different. Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you did exactly what the best agents do. You saw innocent people in danger and you acted to protect them, regardless of personal cost. Richardson stood and walked to the window. The Caradu case isn't over. He has resources, connections, and a long memory. Kevin Thompson will need protection during the trial, and there will be other attempts on his life. We need someone who understands this case, someone with the skills to keep him alive. You have other agents. None who've been inside Carado's organization like you have. None who understand his methods as intimately. Richardson turned back to face her. None who have as much reason to see him brought to justice. Natasha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. 2 years ago, she'd walked away from this world because she couldn't handle the responsibility of life and death choices. Tonight, she'd made those same choices without hesitation. I need time to think. You have until Monday. After that, we'll have to assign the Thompson case to someone else, and your window for returning to the bureau closes permanently. Richardson headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Natasha, what you did tonight reminded me why I recruited you in the first place. You don't just have the skills to be an agent. You have the heart for it. The question is whether you're ready to trust yourself again. After he left, Natasha sat alone in the security office, staring out at the hospital that had become her sanctuary. The building was returning to normal operations, but she knew nothing would ever be quite the same. Her secret was out, her past had caught up with her, and now she had to choose between the life she'd built and the life she'd abandoned. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. James entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Rough morning?" he asked, sitting beside her. "The FBI wants me back." James was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "And what do you want?" "I want to stay here. I want to keep dancing with you at hospital parties and sharing coffee in the break room at 3 a.m. I want to be normal." "But," Natasha sighed. "But there's a 17-year-old boy upstairs who's alive because I couldn't be normal when it mattered. And there's a criminal who's been hurting people for years, who might finally face justice if I help put him away. So you think you should go back?" "I think I'm terrified of going back. And I'm terrified of staying." She looked at him directly. "James, if I take this job, it means danger. It means my past could follow me here, could put you and everyone else at risk." James set down his coffee and took her hands. "Natasha, last night I watched you risk everything to protect people you barely knew. That's not something you do once and then forget about. That's who you are. You're saying I should leave? I'm saying you should do what feels right, and trust that the people who love you will find a way to make it work." The word, love, hung between them, said so naturally that it took a moment for its weight to register. "You love me?" she asked softly. "I love your courage, your compassion, your terrible taste in late-night vending machine snacks, and your ability to make cleaning supply closets seem like the most important places in the world." James smiled. "I love that you see protecting people as a calling, not a job. And I love that you're strong enough to make the hard choices, even when they scare you." Natasha felt tears threaten. "If I go back to the FBI, there's no guarantee we'll have a normal relationship. There will be cases, travel, danger." "There's no guarantee of a normal relationship anyway," James replied. "But there's a guarantee that if you don't follow your instincts about this, you'll always wonder what could have been." They sat in comfortable silence as Natasha wrestled with her decision. Through the window she could see Kevin Thompson's parents arriving, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. Their son would live to testify, live to see justice done, because she'd been willing to step out of hiding when it mattered most. Maybe Richardson was right. Maybe she couldn't run from who she was. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. "If I do this," she said finally, "I want to do it right. No more hiding, no more pretending to be someone I'm not." "Good," James said. "Because the woman I fell in love with is someone who faces challenges head-on." Natasha stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where Vincent Cardew was probably planning his next move, where Kevin Thompson was recovering under guard, where somewhere else another innocent person might need protection. She thought about Chicago, about the choices that had driven her away from this life. But she also thought about last night, about the clarity she'd felt when the stakes were clear and the mission was simple: protect innocent people. Maybe it was time to stop running from her mistakes and start learning from them. "Monday," she said to herself, then louder, "I'll give Richardson my answer on Monday." James joined her at the window, his arms sliding around her waist. "Whatever you decide, we'll figure it out." For the first time since Detective Rodriguez had mentioned Vincent Carredo's name, Natasha felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had a choice to make, but she didn't have to make it alone. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Natasha's mood as she sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone. Richardson had texted twice asking for her decision, but she hadn't responded yet. The weekend had been surreal. News of the hospital incident had spread quickly, and suddenly everyone knew that the quiet night janitor was actually a former federal agent. Some staff members looked at her with new respect, others with suspicion, and a few seemed almost afraid of her. The only person who treated her exactly the same was James. He'd spent Saturday evening with her, bringing takeout Chinese food and listening as she worked through her conflicted feelings about returning to the FBI. He didn't push or advise, he just provided steady, reassuring presence while she sorted through 2 years of suppressed emotions. "The thing is," she told him while they sat on her couch, "I became an agent because I wanted to protect people. But somewhere along the way it became about the cases, the career, the adrenaline. I lost sight of why I started." "And now?" James had asked. "Now I remember. When I saw those men threatening you, threatening the patients, it wasn't about proving anything or advancing my career. It was just about keeping good people safe." "That sounds like a pretty good reason to go back." Natasha had smiled ruefully. "It also sounds like a pretty good reason to stay." I can protect people here too in smaller ways. Make sure the hospital is safe and clean and running smoothly. You can, James had agreed. But you'd always wonder about the bigger picture. About Kevin Thompson and Vincent Caradu and all the other cases you could have worked. Now, sitting alone in her apartment, Natasha realized he was right. The past 3 days had shown her that she couldn't compartmentalize her life the way she'd hoped. Her training, her instincts, her deep need to fight injustice. These weren't things she could simply turn off by changing jobs. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Richardson's name appeared on the screen. "Director," she answered. "Natasha. I need an answer. The U.S. Attorney wants to move forward with Caradu, and we need to know if you're in or out. I have conditions." Richardson paused. "I'm listening. I want to stay based here in the city. No transfers, no out-of-state assignments unless absolutely critical. And I want input on my cases. No more being handed missions without context or consultation. Done. What else? I want protection for Kevin Thompson extended through the entire trial and appeal process. Not just until he testifies. Also done. Anything else?" Natasha took a deep breath. "I want to finish my commitment to the hospital. 2 weeks' notice, proper handoff of my duties. They've been good to me and I won't leave them scrambling for coverage. Natasha, we need you now. Carado's lawyers are already filing motions to suppress Thompson's testimony. Every day we wait is a day Kevin stays alive because he has protection. 2 weeks, Director. That's non-negotiable." Richardson sighed. "Fine. 2 weeks. But I want you consulting on the Caradu case during that time. Off the books, just reviewing files and strategies." "Agreed. Welcome back, Agent Williams." After hanging up, Natasha sat in the quiet of her apartment, feeling both relieved and terrified. She'd made her choice, but now she had to live with the consequences. Her first call was to James. "How do you feel?" he asked after she'd told him about her conversation with Richardson. "Like I just jumped off a cliff without knowing if my parachute works." James laughed. "That sounds about right for a major life decision. Want some company while you figure out if you're flying or falling?" "Always." An hour later, they sat in the hospital cafeteria, sharing a late breakfast and discussing the practical implications of her choice. "So you'll be Agent Williams again but living here working cases in the city?" James summarized. "That's the plan. Though honestly, I have no idea how this is going to work long term." "We'll figure it out," James said confidently. "One day at a time." "James?" Natasha reached across the table and took his hand. "You need to understand what you're signing up for. Federal agents don't have normal relationships. There will be late nights, dangerous cases, times when I can't tell you where I'm going or what I'm doing. And you need to understand what you're signing up for," James replied. "Emergency room doctors don't have normal relationships either. I work weird hours, deal with life and death situations daily, and sometimes come home covered in other people's blood." Natasha smiled despite her worry. "When you put it that way, maybe we're perfect for each other. Two highly trained professionals who are dedicated to helping people and terrible at work-life balance? Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty good match." Over the next 2 weeks, Natasha worked both her old job and prepared for her new one. During the day, she reviewed FBI files on Vincent Caradu, reacquainting herself with his criminal organization and planning strategy for Kevin Thompson's protection. At night, she maintained her janitorial duties, training her replacement and saying goodbye to the life she'd built in the hospital. The hardest part was the reactions from her coworkers. Some, like the emergency room nurses, were thrilled to learn about her background and peppered her with questions about her cases. Others, particularly some of the older doctors who'd treated her dismissively when they thought she was just a janitor, now seemed embarrassed by their previous behavior. "Don't let it go to your head," Mrs. Chen from the billing department told her with a wink. "You may be a fancy federal agent, but you still make terrible coffee." The comment made Natasha laugh, and she realized that these small, normal interactions were what she'd missed most about her time as a janitor. The simplicity of being valued for basic human kindness rather than specialized skills. On her last night, James found her in the supply closet where they'd first had a real conversation. "Feeling nostalgic?" he asked. "A little. This place saved me, you know. When I was drowning in guilt and regret, this job gave me a purpose that didn't require me to carry a weapon or make impossible choices. And now you're going back to weapons and impossible choices." "Now I'm going back to them with a different perspective," Natasha corrected. "I know what it feels like to have a normal life, to be valued for simple things like showing up and doing honest work. That changes everything." James stepped closer. So does knowing that you have someone who'll be here when you come home from those impossible choices. He kissed her then, soft and certain, and Natasha felt the last of her fear fade away. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. Ready for your new adventure? He asked. Natasha looked around the supply closet one last time, then at the man who'd helped her find her way back to herself. Ready, she said and meant it. 6 months later, Special Agent Natasha Williams stood in the courthouse steps, watching Vincent Caradu being led away in handcuffs. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, but Kevin Thompson's testimony had been devastating. The young man had recovered fully from his injuries and faced down his would-be killer with remarkable courage. Another one down, said Agent Marcus Rodriguez, her new partner. Carado's looking at life without parole. Natasha nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with career advancement or personal vindication. This was about justice for 12 witnesses who died because of her previous failures, and protection for Kevin Thompson, who'd lived because she'd learned from her mistakes. Buy you a celebratory coffee? Marcus asked. Rain check. I have somewhere to be. Natasha drove across town to Metropolitan General Hospital, where she now served as Director of Security in addition to her FBI duties. Richardson had approved the unusual arrangement after she'd proven that her inside knowledge of the hospital made her invaluable for protecting witnesses and coordinating federal cases that involved medical facilities. She parked in her old spot and walked through the emergency room entrance, nodding to the staff she'd worked alongside for 8 months. Nothing had really changed. She still knew every corner of the building, still cared deeply about keeping the patients and staff safe. But now she did it with federal authority and a badge instead of a mop and bucket. Agent Williams. Dr. Sarah Martinez called out. How did the trial go? Guilty on all counts, Natasha replied. Kevin Thompson can finally stop looking over his shoulder. That's wonderful news. Oh, and Dr. Patterson is looking for you. Something about dinner plans? Natasha smiled and headed toward James's office, feeling the familiar warmth that came with coming home. Their relationship had weathered the transition better than either of them had expected. James's unpredictable schedule as head of emergency medicine actually complemented her irregular FBI assignments, and their shared commitment to helping people gave them common ground that transcended their different professions. She found him finishing paperwork, his dark hair slightly mussed from a long day of surgery. Heard you got your guy, he said, looking up with a smile. We got him. Kevin's testimony was incredible. He looked Caradu right in the eye and told the jury exactly what he saw in that warehouse. James stood and pulled her into his arms. How does it feel? Like closure, Natasha said honestly. Like I finally finished something I started 2 years ago. And now I have a new case starting Monday. Art theft ring with connections to 3 different hospitals in the city. Apparently they're using medical supply shipments to transport stolen paintings. James laughed. Only you would find a way to combine federal investigation with hospital security. It's a gift, Natasha replied, then grew more serious. James, there's something I need to tell you. His expression became concerned. What is it? Richardson offered me a promotion. Assistant director position in D.C. It would mean more money, more authority, a chance to shape policy instead of just working cases. That's incredible. It sounds like exactly the kind of opportunity you deserve. I turned it down. James blinked in surprise. Why? Because 2 years ago I thought career advancement was what mattered. I thought if I could just climb high enough, work the biggest cases, prove myself to the right people, then I'd find satisfaction. Natasha cupped his face gently. But satisfaction isn't about reaching the top of something. It's about finding work that feels meaningful and people who make you want to be better. Natasha. I love my job here. I love protecting this hospital, working cases that help real people, coming home to you every night. I love the balance we've found between federal work and local connection. She smiled. I love that Mrs. Chin still complains about my coffee even though I outrank half the hospital now. James kissed her forehead. Are you sure? It's a big opportunity to pass up. I'm sure. Besides, Richardson said there will be other promotions, other opportunities. For now, I want to stay exactly where I am. Good, James said firmly. Because I have something to tell you too. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box, causing Natasha's heart to skip several beats. James? 6 months ago, you told me you were terrified of going back to the FBI because it might put me in danger, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring. What you didn't understand is that I was already in danger. the danger of falling completely in love with a woman who was too afraid of her own strength to see how amazing she is. Natasha felt tears welling up in her eyes. You've spent 2 years running from who you are, but who you are is someone who protects people, who fights for justice, who makes impossible situations better just by being there. James took her left hand. I don't want normal, Natasha. I want extraordinary. I want late-night phone calls about federal cases and coffee at 3 a.m. and dancing at hospital Christmas parties with the most incredible woman I've ever met. James? Marry me, he said simply. Let's build something together that's worth protecting. Natasha looked at the ring, at James's hopeful face, at the office where they'd first talked about their shared commitment to helping people heal. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the mistakes, the guilt, the running, the hiding, and finally the courage to step back into the light. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, absolutely yes. As James slipped the ring onto her finger, Natasha felt the last piece of her broken life click back into place. She was Agent Williams again, but she was also Natasha. The woman who'd learned that true strength came not from working alone, but from finding people worth protecting and letting them protect you in return. Outside the office window, Metropolitan General Hospital hummed with its eternal rhythm of crisis and healing, life and death, hope and despair. It was the same chaos she'd walked into 10 months ago, but now she saw it differently. Now she saw it as home. So, James said, still holding her close, ready for our next adventure? Natasha Williams, former federal agent, former janitor, current FBI director of hospital security, and newly engaged woman, looked at the man who'd helped her find her way back to herself and smiled. Ready, she said, and this time she knew exactly what that meant. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining Natasha and James on their journey from hidden identities to honest love. This story explores how sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely before we can find who we're truly meant to be. I'd love to hear from you. What did you think about Natasha's decision to leave the FBI initially? Do you believe people can really change their fundamental nature, or do we always return to who we truly are? And what was your favorite moment between Natasha and James as their relationship developed? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights always help me become a better storyteller.